Elvis Costello once said, "You have 20 years to write your first album, and you have 6 months to write your second one." The rush to get more music out for your fans, along with the challenge of deciding how to follow up your first album, often leads to either too much or too little pressure on the quality of the second one. Some bands have used it to take a sudden 180-degree turn. Others have tried to just do the same thing again and see if the formula keeps working. Either can work depending on the artist, but either can also lead to a sophomore slump. This video is not about the sophomore slump, it's about the sophomore slam, when a band turns around and delivers a career best for their second album. I've come up with some examples, and I'd love to hear yours as well in the comments. Hi, I'm Michael. This is Eclecticism. Okay, a few disclaimers before I start. This list is totally subjective, and it's based on my personal opinion. Sometimes I agree with common consensus, other times it's going to sound like a hot take. Either way, feel free to agree or disagree in the comments. Here are 11 examples of sophomore slams. Let's start with one that a lot of people are going to disagree with. The Strokes, Room on Fire. The Strokes had a lot of momentum behind their first album, and a lot of promotion, making it sound like they were going to be the biggest band in the world. Their first album title, Is This It?, was actually a joke about how the world might react to their first album once it finally came out. However, Is This It? Was a very good album. They followed it up though with Room on Fire, which in my opinion, delivered on the promises of the first album and then some. It was a tight, catchy rock album that wore its inspirations on its sleeve, and its inspirations were really cool. To me, it was a step up in production, with a set of songs that were more consistent and also better sequenced. Tracks like Meet Me in the Bathroom, Reptilia, and Automatic Stop were soundtracks to 2003 for me. I can't tell you how many times I played this while driving around with friends late at night. 2. Public Enemy. Public Enemy's second album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, took what they'd done on their first album and pushed it further. The Bomb Squad production is gritty and grimy, sounding like the band was merging punk sensibilities with the traditions of hip-hop to make something that was brand new. They upped the speed from the first album as well, adding a stronger sense of urgency. Chuck D's focus on social issues, paired with the over-the-top Flava Flav, was able to make something that was socially conscious and rebellious, but that also never felt like it was taking itself too seriously to also be a good time. Check out songs like Rebel Without a Pause and Don't Believe the Hype. There's a reason this is a hip-hop classic. Fear of a Black Planet is also amazing, but I come back to this one the most. 3. Lorde, Melodrama. Lorde had a great debut album, so she had a lot to live up to. And did she ever live up to it? Melodrama is a stunning pop album. It feels more emotionally mature and expansive, with production that suits her voice to make a pop album that feels like such a fully fleshed out artistic vision. It feels somehow introverted and introspective, but also sultry and nocturnal. You have bangers like Homemade Dynamite and Green Light that could fit in the dance club, but also still fits this mood that's fairly chill and nocturnal. Even at these most frenetic moments, it feels intimate still. I know Jack Antonoff gets a lot of hate, but his production work here is really impressive, and suits Lorde's vision for an album wonderfully. I know Lorde only has 3 albums so far, so who knows what's to come. For now though, her second is the one I connect with the most. 4. Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream. The first Smashing Pumpkins album, Gish, had a great sound and some great songs, but holy shit did they blow it out of the water with their second release. Siamese Dream is a masterpiece that took the guitar layering effects of shoegaze bands like My Bloody Valentine and merged them with catchier hooks and harder elements of rock to create an album that influenced a lot of bands later in the 90s. And it's still influencing bands today. Speaking of today, Today has such an iconic opening riff. Geek USA goes hard, and Cherub Rock followed by Quiet is such a good opening pair of tracks for an album. And Silverfuck is so good. Burial, Untrue. Burial's second album, Untrue, was a step up in his own artistry, and a landmark album in electronic music. It feels hazy and subterranean in how it manipulates R&B vocal samples and chops them into something that feels at once dark and off-kilter, but also strangely mellow and almost relaxing. I'm not an expert in electronic music, but I do wonder how much of an influence this album had on the lo-fi beats genre. Either way, it stands on its own as a monumental album in electronic music. Although Untrue came out back in 2007, Burial has yet to release a third album. However, he's stayed active, releasing EPs regularly ever since. I'm curious whether he'll ever feel like it's the right time for another album-length project. 6. Bobbie Gentry, The Delta Suite. Bobbie Gentry was a country songwriter who made a name for herself in the late 60s, in part because of the hit Ode to Billy Joe, from her debut album of the same name. I think her best album, though, is The Delta Suite. This is a concept album, suite being a play on the word sweet. She explores different facets of growing up in Mississippi, from love to work to religion, and weaves in more than just country with elements of soul and funk. Side note, although she's often remembered as a country artist, part of her dissatisfaction with the music industry was the way she was forced to fit into this mold. When she decided she wanted to make a jazz album, for example, her record company refused to support her release it. Her dissatisfaction with the recording industry would lead her to retiring from it in the early 1970s, and I find it sad how few people know about this underrated songwriter. Please go check this out. 7. Lady Gaga, The Fame Monster. It's wild to think that The Fame Monster was originally going to just be an EP to accompany The Fame, which was already a strong start for Lady Gaga. But this set of tracks, less than a year after her debut, feels like a greatest hits album, with quite a few of my favorite tracks she's ever recorded. I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, but when this came out, I was still a bit of a music snob who wouldn't listen to pop beyond a few albums I felt like were acceptably cool. Lady Gaga is one of the artists that changed my mind about this. From her music to the dramatic videos and outfits, it was clear to me that this was someone with a real artistic vision, and I couldn't help but get excited about it. 8. Nine Inch Nails, The Downward Spiral. The first album by Trent Reznor, Pretty Hate Machine, is a classic in its own right. But comparing that to this, to paraphrase Jay-Z, is like comparing a candle to the sun. He went from taking techno-industrial and making it more accessible on that first album to creating one of the darkest, densest, and heaviest albums I can think of, outside of noise or extreme metal. It feels like a concept album about the descent into despair. Every moment of the production feels precise and perfectly considered. But Trent also shows skill in giving you enough breathing space so that when one of the hardest tracks arrive, you've recovered just enough to once again get hit with the full brunt of it. It's an album that lets you recover just enough to pick you up and give you another pile driver as soon as you think you might be okay. I'd only recommend this one when you're in an emotionally stable place, but I would strongly recommend it. I'm too indecisive to really make a top 50 albums list, but I'm sure this would be on it, if not in the top 20. 9. Lush, Split. Lush were a wonderful band from the beginning, a shoegaze band with harmonizing female vocalists. Their sound was distinct and beautiful from the first EPs, but their second album, Split, was the high point of their songwriting for me. From more precise production to songs that feel a touch more refined and mature, with a greater range shown than on the debut. By their third album, I was a little less interested in what they were doing. They moved a little closer to Britpop and lost my interest, but Split is still one of my favorite shoegaze albums. 10. Black Flag, My War. Black Flag is one of the quintessential American hardcore punk bands, and they also helped to pave the way for how underground or alternative bands could successfully release music and tour in the early 80s. That alone would be enough to solidify their place as an important band. But with My War, they decided to maintain the heaviness and loudness of their earlier releases and slow it down to a lurching crawl. The second half of My War was something new for the time, and it was heavily influential on bands that would come later, from stoner and sludge metal groups like Melvins, to the grunge bands that would take over the alternative scene in the following decade, like Mudhoney and Nirvana. At the time, a lot of critics said it was Black Flag going too heavy metal, but what they were doing on here wasn't like any heavy metal that had come before. In a sense, though, those critics were right, since it created a whole new subgenre of metal with just the last 3 tracks on the album. 11. Nirvana, Nevermind. Okay, here's one where most people would probably say the second album is the best, but, plot twist, I disagree. Nevermind is an important album. It changed rock music overnight, making the underground bands cool, and the previously cool bands all seem out of date. They hit number 1 with an album that was clearly inspired by underground artists like Wipers and the Pixies. It was loud and full of guitar feedback, and had a really long track of noise and shrieking called Endless Nameless. Not something you'd usually find on a chart-topping album. However, I think the production feels too polished for the songs, and I genuinely prefer the sound of their first album, Bleach. The songs on Bleach are already catchy and even more stripped back than what Nirvana would do on Nevermind, so to me, it's just a little bit better. But my actual favorite Nirvana album is their final one, In Utero. Instead of moving toward the mainstream, In Utero had some songs that are heavier than anything they'd done before, yet it balances these with sad ballads with abstract lyrics like Pennyroyal Tea. While the lyrics are still not especially obvious, there are hints throughout of Kurt Cobain's struggle with fame, giving the album more of a theme than they'd had on Nevermind. And I'm a sucker for an album with a bit of a theme. So for me, Nirvana's Nevermind comes in third out of 3. However, to be clear, I do love all 3. There we go, 10 sophomore slams, and then what I consider one of the greatest sophomore slumps of all time. Let me know in the comments what albums you think were sophomore slams and why. Who did I leave out? Where do you agree and disagree? I do already have enough sophomore slams to do at least another video on this topic, but I'd also love to know what albums you would nominate. If you want to hear me ramble some more about music-related topics, please subscribe. If you want to give me a small dopamine hit, hit the like button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.